The state's two teacher organizations, MEA and MFT, both came to realize that to further their goals, they needed to shape the public debate about education. Along with a growing use of the media, that meant getting involved in recruiting and endorsing candidates for public office. It meant lobbying in government at both the state and local levels. Other unions were recognizing the connection between union activity and political action. United Auto Workers President Walter Reuther noted, "There's a direct relationship between the ballot box and the bread box. What the union fights for and wins at the bargaining table can be taken away in the legislative halls." In Minnesota, union members and farmers took their advocacy a step further, forming the Farmer Labor Party, one of the most successful third-party movements in U.S. history. Farmer labor leaders like Governor Floyd B. Olson guided Minnesota through the difficult years of the Great Depression and created a legacy of support for working families and public education that continues today. In the 1940s, teachers developed a strong and lasting relationship with a young Minneapolis mayor named Hubert Humphrey, who went on to become a U.S. Senator and Vice President under Lyndon Johnson.
The history of the labor movement needs to be taught in every school in this land. We need to know our roots.
As more decisions affecting the future of schools were being made in Congress and at the state capitol, educators campaigned for candidates who supported public education and built relationships with elected officials who shared their convictions. Union members also started to run for office themselves. Today, many Education Minnesota members serve in local elected office, in the Minnesota legislature, and in Congress. Political action paid off when Minnesota teachers won legislation providing tenure, first in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth, then in districts in greater Minnesota. Teacher retirement plans were established. In 1953, Minneapolis teachers became the first in the nation to have transfer and grievance policies. But progress was slow, and pay remained low compared to other professions. Educators still had no legal right to organize and to bargain with school districts. In the period after World War II, both the MFT and MEA grew, but school boards and administrators retained power over almost everything affecting teachers' lives. In 1968, faced with growing pressure from the MEA, the legislature passed the Meet and Confer Act. That law required school boards to negotiate wages and working conditions with teachers. In the 3 years it was in effect, teacher salaries in Minnesota rose almost 70%. But the meet and confer process was flawed. Those shortcomings became abundantly clear in 1970 when Minneapolis teachers were forced to strike. Their walkout is often viewed as the final spur to passage of the Minnesota Public Employment Labor Relations Act. Adopted in 1971, PELRA is one of the strongest laws for public employees in the nation. Among other provisions, PELRA gives educators the right to strike. In 1973, the Hermantown Federation of Teachers staged the first legal teacher strike in Minnesota. Numerous other walkouts occurred in the 1970s and into the early 1980s as educators exercised this new right to withhold their labor.
Yesterday, nearly 900 of them took to the streets. The first teacher strike in Minnesota this year, the first ever in Rochester.
For the first time ever, Spring Lake Park's 260 teachers are on strike.
Since the early 1970s, local unions have engaged in more than 20 rounds of bargaining that have literally changed the face of labor management relations. Today's educators are accustomed to a structured process that results in a written contract. Contracts govern not only wages and benefits, but also professional development and educational quality. Today's contracts build on the success of the bargaining that began to take place on a regular basis after the passage of PELRA. Progress for teachers was accompanied by a renewed commitment to public education in the form of what became known as the Minnesota Miracle. Under the Minnesota Miracle, the state would shoulder a greater share of the cost for schools. That would take the burden off property taxpayers and provide a basic level of funding for all school districts, regardless of property value. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter signed into law a bill creating the U.S. Department of Education. Both national teacher organizations, AFT and NEA, were instrumental in its passage. Those years also meant a move toward greater equity for all, regardless of gender, race, or ethnic background. Until the early 1960s, male teachers, considered the head of household, could be paid more than female teachers. And even into the 1970s, a pregnant teacher was expected to resign, with no guarantee of being rehired after having her baby. In some areas, married couples were not allowed to teach in the same school district. For many years, male and female teachers were in separate union locals. Members of the MFT and MEA fought to change these practices. Today, Education Minnesota continues its efforts to advance social justice and challenge institutionalized discrimination. In the 1970s, both MEA and MFT began organizing paraprofessionals and school-related staff. They knew that all school workers deserve fair salaries and appropriate working conditions. Contracts began to reflect the need for high standards for classroom aides and other education professionals as well as teachers. Today, these educators form an important part of Education Minnesota. Also in the 1970s, MFT and MEA members began to question the need for two competing organizations to represent educators. Leaders of both groups began discussing how to end the competition between them and move toward merger. The first steps toward unification took place at the local level. In 1992, the Rosemount Federation of Teachers and the Rosemount Education Association combined to form the Dakota County United Educators. Their leadership paved the way for more mergers in other local school districts and in higher education. In 1994, MEA and MFT technical college units formed the United Technical College Educators. 4 years later, on September 1, 1998, MFT and MEA merged to become Education Minnesota, one of the largest unions in the state. Education Minnesota is a first-of-its-kind organization affiliated with both the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. Education Minnesota is also an important part of the broader labor movement through its membership in the AFL-CIO. However, the core of educator power remains at the community level, in the local unions that represent educators in their buildings and school districts. Through Education Minnesota, these local unions come together to support each other and speak with one voice to the governor, the legislature, and the public. While institutions and structure are important, the history of Education Minnesota has always been one of individuals. People who made the choice to get involved and make the world a better place for themselves and their students. Some went on to hold high positions in their organization, while others did the hard work but were little known outside their local community. All were leaders whose drive and determination created the strong public schools and the professional workforce we have today. The 21st century poses many challenges. Attacks on public education, cuts in funding, increased demands, and pressure to do more with less. As Education Minnesota continues to advocate for quality public education for all students, new leaders will emerge. We can all honor the sacrifices of the past as we write a new chapter in our legacy of leadership.